So welcome to the first edition of the Identity Roundtable. This is your Entratainment podcast. And we don't have a roundtable, but this will probably be one of the most well-produced episodes as we're actually here at the MVP Summit, recording in this very nice Microsoft studio. And just to introduce ourselves, I'm Eric Woodruff, Entra Idol of 2025. And with me also, that will hopefully be reoccurring on the podcast, we have Thomas, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, it's great to be here. My name is Thomas Naunheim, Microsoft MVP from Germany and a cybersecurity architect at Clucania.
And Rue, who I won't pronounce your full first name, Campbell?
Yeah, so my first full name looks like a Wi-Fi password. So we don't do that. So Rue Campbell, MVP for security. I'm practice lead of Microsoft Security at Threatscape, and I am completely overshadowed when it comes to identity security by the guys I'm with today. So I'm going to learn a lot here.
Well, it's probably hopefully learning for everyone. And I do want to mention that Michael Van Hornbeek is also going to be one of the co-hosts of this podcast. Unfortunately, he couldn't join us for the MVP Summit, but he gave us the blessing to go ahead without him. But as you probably noticed, there's a fourth person in the room, and I want to introduce our guest here, Nathan McNulty, which just proves, right, that he's not just a Patriot Consulting AI chatbot on Twitter. So. Nathan, if you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. Nathan McNulty, I'm a MVP in security, shooting for Entra Idol 2026, so vote for me. And cybersecurity architect at Patriot Consulting.
All right,
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here, Nathan.
Yeah.
So we thought we'd just kick things off with, everyone's sort of latest favorite, GA or public preview thing that they like. And Thomas, if you have something on your mind there, what would be your favorite thing that's come out recently in the Entra world?
I think there's a ton of announcements from RSA, right? And also when we are now in the new year, even in March, there's a lot of things coming up. And for me, it was everything related to passkeys. There's also some other stuff like tenant governance. But what do you think about the passkey announcements?
Yeah, well, I mean, right there with you, passkey stuff is very cool news. I love the Windows Hello play for like BYRD servers and stuff like that. And I guess if I kind of piggy on the back of cool new announcements, number one, I kind of have to remind myself what's public preview. So I'm going to play it really safe here because I've been in trouble before and I ain't going back there. I seen just today actually public preview of talking about identity, the Defender for identity space, the automatic migration purely from the portal of the V2 sensor to the V3 sensor. So that's pretty cool, and it kind of, to me, just kind of shows this whole unification of Defender for endpoint and Defender for identity getting a little bit more mature and easier for customers.
So I'm actually not that familiar with that. I mean, I guess a bit deper, like you're talking about from the V2 to V3. Like, what is the long story short there, like the benefit and that?
Sure, great question. So historically, Defender for identity and Defender for endpoint, these were separate services. They eventually get unified into Defender XDR, previously Microsoft 365 Defender, and they were separate agents, separate sensors, separate binaries. They kind of got merged. So the fun name to play about with it was the Defensor, so it's unification of MDE and MDI in terms of what you rolled out. And if you already had rolled out Defender for Identity on that version 2, version 3 being the unified one, you can now completely migrate automatically just via the portal. You go into the portal, it'll show you all your sensors, and then you say, hey, it's ready to migrate, go do it for me. So as long as you've got Defender for Endpoint on there and you meet a few other prerequisites, it'll do all that for you, and it'll roll out all the kind of existing config you had for V2, it'll migrate that to V3. It's in public preview right now, so it does have to be said, I'm telling you the vision of what might happen, might be a few bumps in the road, but that's going to go a long way. And I used to get some really good consultancy days out of that project, so there goes that.
So, and anything that comes to mind for you, Nathan? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it's the passkeys.
Yeah,
right?
the passkeys.
I've done a little bit of work on that.
Yeah, just a little bit. Well, I mean, you've had your interesting work that was going around the socials with being able to use passkeys sort of in an automated way, right? Which I think is interesting. I think people see both the good and maybe the not so good with that sort of stuff.
Absolutely.
But I guess actually, if you wouldn't mind giving a bit of insight into like what led you down the road of trying to play with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's certain portals, certain software we might want to use that historically has required password. Right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to get away from that. Need to be able to pass the MFA requirements for portals as well. And so, of course, traditional service accounts, or what we might call service accounts, right? A user account that has password, and then we're doing like OTP, or if you've got a human in the loop kind of deal, like pushing a button, right? But now we can actually access certain resources that traditionally applications haven't been able to get to, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So one of the most helpful things to frame of mind for me has been looking at passkeys as like an SSH key instead of like a certificate, right? Even though it is a kind of a cert under the hood and all that, but a lot of the traditional sysadmins were like, oh, I would automate tasks on a server. I just use my SSH key and boom, it logs in, does all the things. And so I feel like it's a very similar feel, right?
Yep.
Using those software passkeys.
Yep.
That's what I'm calling them anyway.
And if I can dig into that, as someone who's not too familiar with SSH and the technology there, what is it? Why is that comparison appropriate? Why is it so similar to that?
It's not tied back to PKI in any way, so it's more like, we just randomly generated an RSE key pair and then we're using that to authenticate. So, yeah, there's not like a central place you can go to revoke it, really. I mean, like on the identity provider, right, in Entra, we can go remove it from a user, but it's a little different than going back to PKI and saying, nope, this one's revoked. So.
Nathan's getting too close to talking about Linux.
Supported in Intune.
But I mean, I think it touches on an area. Well, the broader thing that's kind of come out are synced passkeys, right? Which are it's not new, and it's been a bigger conversation in the industry, I'd say, for a couple of years now. But I guess I'm curious, like thoughts on synced passkeys, like just. Yay or nay? You good with sync passkeys?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. In room?
Yeah, absolutely as well. It's obvious consultant asterisks. It depends. Global admins, no. Less privileged roles, absolutely. Makes a ton of sense.
And I think that's important that we have the passkey profiles to make it even granular. Who are their audience, or what is the audience to use passkeys, under which conditions, and having more and more adoption also. What are the platforms or the combinations where you can use passkeys is really the key, in my opinion.
Yeah. So you're good with sync passkeys?
I would totally agree on it depends, but honestly, there are so many scenarios like frontline workers or even also from external collaborators where you don't like to have an authenticator app in place or like to have a full integration into the mobile OS platform and makes it a better user experience.
Yeah.
So at least there are a couple of reasons, different use cases where you go with sync passkeys.
Okay. Yeah. No, I'd agree. And I mean, I know there's, times, absolutely, where you want to still use 502, right? It's still the gold standard with, everyone calls them YubiKeys, but not to just pitch YubiKey, right? Or authenticator app with device bound. But as people would know if they watched Drew's other podcast and lots of podcasts where I've been pitching passkeys, I'd say, we did a device bound rollout, and now we're going to have the interesting case study of probably going to synced passkeys for a lot of people. Just worries about when people get new devices. It's not the first thing on your mind when you go get a new phone, and unless you're a consultant who sits in the Apple store for an hour and a half with old authenticator and new authenticator.
It's such a good point, because so often you see the help desk come through and it's like, hey, I got a new phone, I can't get to my system. And that's just, when you work at an organization of any scale, that just really bogs stuff down.
Absolutely.
And it's unrealistic to expect folks to keep work in mind when they get a new personal phone.
Yep.
So the Syncable solves that problem.
Yeah. No, and I mean, I think that also touches on, right, where typically, now you could say, well, the help desk could issue like a tap, but, remote workers and all this sort of stuff, right? Like, then how do you know that it's not social engineering or something like that against,
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And there's also another aspect. So, of course, we have some attack surface with sync passkeys as well. But when it comes to endpoint security in the identity story, there's always something that we need to consider, because there are also tokens on the device, which could be also more easily to exfiltrate than a passkey, and could be also very powerful for gaining access. So, that's the overall picture that we need to count in.
Yep.
Yeah, we've got our problems with passwords, and then our problems with synced passkeys. Just trade them out, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I do see, some people sort of argue that a synced passkey is sort of just like a long unknown password, but I think it because it does actually have similarities to me to like SSH keys, right? And you think that has been the standard for a long, long time for accessing, Linux systems, and the benefits, right, outweigh the sort of cons, right? And I mean, I'll just say, because it's interesting too, right? Everyone's always got an angle when they're doing research, and it's nothing against some of the people that have done research against synced passkeys, but right, it tends to be like they might work for a vendor that offers a phishing-resistant solution, right? So, many times there's always a bit of a play depending on.
Yeah.
But
it's a good point. And at the end of the day, well, number one, hopefully this discussion ages well.
Yeah.
In a few months or a few years, this was a terrible idea. I don't think that's going to be the case. At the end of the day, you're never going to have perfect solutions in anything we do, and it's just trade-offs. And I love that comparison of problems with passwords, problems with MFA, problems with syncable. It's just there are currently less problems with this solution than any of the alternatives.
Yeah,
it's the ones we know, and we know how to deal with passwords. Right, we just go rotate it for the user.
Yes.
When it's a passkey, you're like, well, what do I do with that? And a lot of people aren't expecting it to get registered against the user, and so they go rotate a password like they always have, and it doesn't affect the passkey.
Sure.
So it's just a lot of like learning on the admin side. Okay, what is my response supposed to actually be? Now that we've got this new weird credential thing that.
Yeah. And I think it definitely adds, though, I mean, from a troubleshooting perspective, like on help desk, tier 1 people, like getting, the front line of support, it's definitely a learning experience, I think, for a lot of those people. And I think, honestly, as people, right, like, we could sit here big braining this stuff and easily go turn it on, right? But it's trying to remember, like, who's going to be answering the phone and training them up as well, so.
And we can also still use authentication strings to make it a little bit in a different security levels. What kind of authentication method would be strong enough for example, accessing privileged interfaces? So maybe there's still the requirements to have the hardware-bounded classic YubiKeys and so on. So soon we have granular policies that we can use for targeting to our audience. I think then we have a good trade-off.
So when to use synced passkeys the passkey profiles versus when to use a conditional access policy with the auth strengths? What's the deciding factors on those?
I'll take a stab at that one.
Thomas was like, I'm not the passkey guy.
No, but I have seen already a guy.
One I can actually answer.
Softball question, right?
You're the guest. Stop asking questions.
Sorry. Well, you mentioned it, and so I was like, kind of, it's interesting to me. Like, what is the difference? When should I use one over the other? And like, what's
it's a good point, and it's not a case of one versus the other to me, insofar as one controls your registration capability of that authentication method, and then the other is the enforcement engine behind when will this method be allowable. So, for example, in my passkey profiles, I may allow. Let me take an example. Let's say I've got let's call it a sensitive user, so a VIP or an IT person, something like that. I might allow them to register a device-bound and a syncable passkey. But then, in my authentication strengths, and then via conditional access, depending on the resource you're going to be accessing, I will then enforce different levels of security. So, for example, if you're accessing, let's just say, an everyday productivity app like Office 365, you can use whatever credential you want. Then if you're going to be doing anything to do with administration or sensitive apps like finance-related things, ERP, CRM, maybe at that stage we then enforce an authentication strength that is linked to something that's device-bound. And actually, like, just a caveat on that, currently with authentication strengths, you can't say syncable or device-bound, but you could say specific. What's the term? Is it AAUID? So you could say a specific passkey is allowable or not allowable. So you can't define it at that high level, but you can define it at a lower level in authentication strengths. Kind of strange, but that's the way to think about it.
And that's also a great combination if we have authentication context, that you can say I can access the app, but as far I'm doing a sensitive action by activating PIM or doing something in our MDA protected application, then I have to step up authentication that I have now to use something which is stronger than a sync passkey.
It's a great point, and like the example that you see a lot of that is like something like SharePoint Online, where general SharePoint usage you can just get in with any type of MFA, but if you want to access sensitive resources in SharePoint, step up to require a specific FIDO key or something like that.
Yeah, having the report of the canteen, what is on the lunch for the day, and having sensitive access to board files would be a different security level.
These are different things. Yeah, great point.
Do you see heavy usage of auth contexts out there?
Favorite use of auth context is kind of topical right now is privileged identity management, right? Insofar as one of the common mistakes folks make with PIM is you see that checkbox to say, hey, if you want to become a global admin, require MFA. Yeah. And if you've already satified MFA, it just looks at it and says, So you're not going to re-force to do MFA. Yeah. Authentication contexts are your kind of way of invalidating that MFA requirement and then forcing a new one.
Right. So as you were saying, and we'll figure out how to that later.
Well, I'll tell you what, one thing I'll shift onto, so I'll pause for a second and then I'll move on. And I guess one thing that we would be remiss not to mention is, like kind of in the process of having right now and going into April, is if you are Microsoft managed for a lot of settings, these syncable passkeys, they're going to be available to your users, right? So you guys can fact check me here. I'm going to try and rhyme off the requirements under which this happens. So if you have opted in, if you have not opted in to the public preview of passkey profiles, and you have a Microsoft managed registration campaign for MFA, you check both those boxes, and over the coming months, Microsoft will have a registration campaign for your users that every day is going to nudge them to set up a passkey, and that passkey will be either device bound or syncable. Have I got that right?
I think is that only if you have FIDO2 enabled under?
Yes. Great point.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's something, because I know this again was sort of causing confusion and the messaging wasn't clear, but I think if you don't have that enabled yet, you're safe. Like Microsoft isn't going to go turn FIDO2 on for you. I mean, you should think about it now anyways, but...
So this won't enable passkeys if you have not enabled passkeys, but if you have enabled passkeys, this will enable syncable kind of by default.
Okay, but also then if you, I think from what I understand, if you are requiring attestation, which if you are more historically, if you're not using Authenticator app and you're just using FIDO2 keys, you're not going to have anything change on you, is my understanding. Like, they're not going to go say, oh, well, now you have to use sync passkeys too. So
absolutely.
Right,
I guess at this point, I'm going to refer to our resident passkey correspondent, Nathan. And maybe that's a good point is to pick up, because we talk about attestation, and it's like, well, what does attestation specifically mean and do? And the reason I pick on you to answer this one is you've done a lot of kind of cool research in regards to if you don't require attestation, you're using kind of cool stuff with like Key Vault and all sorts of crazy stuff. So can you you just get me up to speed on this?
Totally. So attestation, the FIDO Alliance, right, they've defined a spec. This is how a passkey should look. This is how you should implement it, all that kind of stuff. So they'll review the implementation like they did with Microsoft Authenticator. They'll look at that and say, okay, this software stack with these specific libraries for handling encryption and all these things, right? These have all been validated. So now Microsoft produces a certificate, private key, that says, this is the specific authenticator. And they map that to an AA GUID. So now whenever we authenticate with that, we do our challenge and response, right? We sign that response. We also wrap that up in attestation. The attestation signs that as well and sends it through. So what that means is on the Entra side, we see, this authentication request came from a YubiKey 5 or the Microsoft Authenticator app or whatever, and it was signed with that attestation certificate. So it maps to the allowed AA GUID, right? Is what that maps to. We can't do that with synced passkeys. There's no attestation on that side. So even if you have the key restrictions in there, where you say these are the only ones I want to allow, if you're allowing synced, it doesn't actually check. Entra can't force it to tell it what it is. So That's one downside to synced, but it's still net positive, I think, in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, right, it's giving you assurance, like it's a guarantee that this came from this key. But I would say, again, in most situations, right, like that's negligible from an overall security perspective, like.
Yeah, and it is just the model, so like it's the software stack or firmware stack, I guess, if you want to look at like a YubiKey, right? So the 5, I think, has 20-something different AA goods associated with it, and it's just because like as they've had firmware vulnerabilities or they've upgraded libraries, it's now a new stack. It has to get recertified, so now it's a new attestation certificate. But fortunately, they're not unique per each key, so you can't like. It's a privacy-preserving thing. You can't track a user across lots of services, which is great. But yeah, that's what it's used for. High assurance, it's great. You know, if we're using a physical key, a lot less software running on there versus Windows or Mac, where a lot more software running there.
Yeah, would expect.
Totally. And so you get a little better assurance. So yeah, we do love like admins. Okay, cool. We're doing the hardware tokens, and then like there's a progression, of course, but it's the ideal. If we can do it, it's great. But don't skip out on passkeys just because oh well, I can't afford hardware keys for everybody kind of thing. So
and you mentioned the syncable passkey cannot do attestation. Again, looking for a fact check here. I've seen online that syncable passkeys will in some cases still get an AA GUID, if I'm saying that right. Like you can go and you can look up them, and one password will have one and stuff like that.
Yeah, they still have the AA GUIDs or whatnot,
right.
But that's still not the same as you can't guarantee that like I used 1Password from this iPhone or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
when I submit it, I can lie and say that I'm
so
going to work.
crude analogy in my head, like a user agent string, it's spoofable, I guess is the point there. Okay.
At this point, yeah, because it's not actually doing the real challenge where it can look up the public key, right?
Understood.
Make sure it's signed.
And what do you think about the cross-device passkey situation? Because that we have some dependency, like we need to have a Bluetooth connection and so on. What about those scenarios where I have something like a secured device and I don't like to allow Bluetooth? So is that another one? Disadvantage?
yeah, I mean, I guess I'd say now, maybe with some of the newer stuff with Windows, right, that you might be able to come around, avoid that. Because in general, that cross-device offlow, I'd say try to avoid it, where people are scanning QR codes. But you need Bluetooth, and you also need internet, because people will sort of question. I mean, you might say, well, if you don't have internet, well, are you trying to get to anyways?
Well, so because why is that? It's a hybrid identity transport.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know all the technical details, and I don't want the real 502 nerds yelling at me, but I think it's something like because it's like Bluetooth low energy, but somehow within that there's not enough. Bluetooth low energy is almost like the equivalent of on the 502 key where you touch it, so it's like proof of presence thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the internet bit is actually where I guess the some other connection piece happens. So
like if you're on an airplane or a train, right, and you pay for the internet, you pay for it on your laptop, you go to authenticate, and you're like, oh, I need my phone. You do the scan thing, and now your phone, you didn't pay for the internet.
Yeah.
It needs your phone's internet to send the challenge response back,
but these
right?
are the things still where I would argue for what most people are doing, or hopefully, if they're probably on their laptop, so they either have a Mac or Windows device, and so they're either already using Hello for Business or Platform SSO. Because I've seen some of these scenarios come up, and my question is but you've already locally authenticated.
Yep.
Why?
Right.
What do you care? And I think though you bring up it kind of leads into the point, right? There's the other passkey bit where now Hello for Business, right?
Yes.
Supports passkeys within Entra, so you could have a secondary account or something, or a registered device, or a
that'll be Hello regular, and then the Hello for Business is the account you log in with. It's a little weird, but you could if you're. Look, it happens, right? We're on our collaboration account, and we need to log into something. We're going to log in with our admin account on the collaboration laptop. It just
test lab, right?
Right. That's No, that's what we see most common, right? Not very many people are using a dedicated VM for admin or a dedicated device or something, right? So, at the very least, now you're not typing an admin password in there. You just store it in Hello as your administrator account, right? So you go to My Sign-ins, you say I want to create a new passkey. It'll prompt on Hello. You type it in. It's saving it in the Hello container locally. You can authenticate with that using your admin now. Is kind of the new change. And really, we want you can have as many passkeys as you want. So like, unlike a password, so just create them on each individual device and keep them local instead of trying to do the weird cross-device setup.
So you can have as many. So is this a challenge? If I go create 10,000 passkeys,
We should find out what the limit is.
You can call Hayden and say,
yeah, I'm sure there's a limit.
I know it's at least 10.
But I will say, and I've had some questions come my way where people are like, "Oh, can I use this instead of Hello for Business?" It's like, well, put my enterprise hat on. It's like, no, right? Like Hello for Business is still what you should be using if it's a Entra or hybrid joined device, right? And it's corporate issued. Like, this is great for secondary, but primarily it's still Hello for Business is the experience that people should be going for. Yeah. So
Platform SSO on Mac.
Yep.
It's the same thing.
Yeah, right.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, anything else, Passkey, or are we aware of that one?
I think I'm good with passkeys now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a simple topic, right? Just turn it on.
I did have one thought though. So the registration campaign, because you brought it up, right?
Yes.
So current state, if I want to go turn on passkeys and I have never enabled it, if I'm in a Microsoft managed scenario on the registration campaign, once I go and turn that on and hit save, suddenly my users might start getting prompted to set up passkeys. That might not be desirable. And so people do need to know, like, okay, I need to go set the registration campaign to enabled or disabled, right, depending on what your desire is. Then go enable passkeys so that you don't end up having a business-wide impact, right, on the day you turn it on.
What it makes me wonder, actually, kind of just hitting off that, are they going to go through, is there going to be an interrupt where they're going to be forced to do a cross-device registration of the passkey?
No, so it's a similar flow to what we have right now.
Okay.
It prompts the user, they can always hit the skip button, right?
Yeah.
But it prompts them once a day. And then it will take them through the registration flow that we have currently when you enforce it with CA.
Yeah.
So it prompts and says, hey, like next wizard, and it'll actually tell the user, go install the Microsoft Authenticator app on your phone, log in using your account. It tries to avoid the whole, you can hit like,
there is
I had a problem, and all that, and then it'll give you the QR code, and then you can do it. But if you are enforcing attestation, we can't do that on iOS, I believe. We can with Android, but not iOS.
Okay.
Something to do with, like, because it's initiating from the iOS app and the way the APIs work in iOS, it can't allow the attestation to look like it's coming from Microsoft Authenticator.
Okay.
It looks like it's a camera app, right?
Yeah.
So it's a little weird, but
And then maybe the final question on that then is, so the Microsoft Managed Registration campaign to nudge folks to do passkeys, would that honor the passkey profiles? So for example, if in my passkey profile I say, hey, it's only going to apply to only this group of folks will be allowed to do passkeys, registration campaign is going to honor that, right? It won't apply to all users?
Yeah, whoever it would be targeted to, right? Yeah, for enabled for passkeys.
Okay.
I would expect
That
that.
makes sense.
And then, the question on the whether it's synced versus not and which one prompts, I think it'll still end up doing, regardless if it's attestation or not, or synced or not. Right?
Okay.
So I think, to double check that.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Nathan said it, folks. Well, I was thinking you had mentioned, I guess, switching topics a bit.
Yeah.
For RSA announcements, also there's stuff around tenant governance, and this one. Well, in my mind, again, Thomas, he is our expert
Over to you,
on tenant governance. If you want to kind of give us the rundown on what that even means.
Yeah, so we had before a feature called Tenant Configuration Management that was already available before this week. And I found it really interesting because you have the opportunity to create a snapshot of your tenant configuration. And what I really love is it's not only about Microsoft Entra. You have also other areas like Exchange where you can create a configuration snapshot. And then working with your desired state. So there has been the community project, maybe you heard about that, this M365 DSC.
Yeah.
And now we have it directly native in Microsoft Graph that we can create snapshots using that snapshot to say this is my security baseline or configuration baseline, and I'm expecting that, for example, this conditional access policy object should be turned on and include the following properties. And if you have a change and that not follows your baseline, then you have a configuration drift. And that is super handy because you can do everything with Microsoft Graph. You have not to configure something like a desired state server or something, so everything is available in Graph. And now we have even more in the tenant governance space because now we have a full story for organization in a multi-tenant environment. And of course, Microsoft said all the time, hey, one company, one tenant, right? And all of your customers have just one tenant, right? But there was and there was a whole story in the past. Of course, there are organizations having staging tenants, having for regulatory compliance different tenants. And even also Microsoft has various tenants, and we have learned with Midnight Blizzard that they have some testing tenants as well. And
they come around and they're like, that's sorry? I'm just joking that they come in and they're like, well,
your time's up. Time's up.
And what is really nice with tenant governance, we have a full story. So you have a discovery to identify if there are any shadow tenants. And they're using B2B signals, and also if you are sharing a billing account and there are other tenants. And then you have the opportunity after you discover a tenant to have something called a governance relationship. And we are all working for MSSP or CSP, so we are aware of GDAP, that we can have a delegated administration relationship. And then using something called a governing tenant, you're so centralized tenant where all the privileged users, for example, are located. And then you can grant over GDAP Entra roles. So that, for example, the global admin is coming from your main tenant and then managing some of your test tenant, resource tenant, call it whatever you like. So there is a reason for another tenant. And this is super helpful because now GDAP is available for every organization, and they can build a little bit of centralized privilege access strategy.
It sounds like you could sort of have like a, what do you call it, like a red tenant.
Something like that. But there are also other colors. So yeah, and I think it's super helpful if you have, for example, for specific business units or for the devs that like to have their very own test environment, some kind of governance. Because now we are connecting the tenant governance relationship story with the configuration management, and then you can also have a security or configuration baseline for all of your tenants, making sure that they're following some at least baselines. And to avoid that, for example, one of your tenants get to be compromised or used for exfiltration. Because a lot of people think about what would be a good option to invite myself B2B to another tenant, and they have no tenant restriction or something like that, and then they have a perfect way of using OneDrive for data exfiltration or something like that.
Yeah, because you look at logs and you just see Entra, so you assume, oh, it's safe.
It's safe. And last but not least, there's also a way to create a tenant through an API, and having more a lifecycle approach to create new tenants, but also to consolidate.
So you can create an Entra tenant through an API now.
Yeah. Right.
So because I mean that's always been a challenge, and I think in particular, sort of with like the M365 developer program, right? I know I don't work in higher ed, but I know like in these scenarios, people have issues, right, churning out tenants. I guess I'd ask if you know, how's the billing piece work? Because there was always like the sort of CAPTCHA, and then there was like the, we need your credit card info. Have you?
Yeah, they call it secure tenant creation because that is working under the umbrella of your billing profile. And not having something like an individual tenant that is disconnected from your, how we can say that, a company profile. And with the features that I mentioned before, you have a discovery, you're taking care on the governance of the tenant. It's not Wild West tenants, right? So they are not completely disconnected.
I mean, it's not because you could go into, I don't remember if you could actually do it in the Entra portal, but the Azure portal for Entra and go click new tenant for a long time, right? But it would sort of be like, they'd be a guest, and if something got messed up, it's like, it's just gone. So this is like going to give you governance over it off the...
Yeah, right. So there's the new plate, so feel free to check it out. There's a new tenant governance entry in the Entra portal, and that allows you to manage this configuration management, managing also the relationships for the delegated admin model. And we have also a new announcement at RSC about cross-tenant group synchronization. Because, of course, you would like maybe to synchronize security groups for assigning outside of the Entra RBAC. And that is also something they add to the story.
So, I mean, I guess let me ask you, you had a couple of things came to mind. First, I guess I was going to ask, because you mentioned M365 desired state config, like, do you see this replacing that, or is it complementary? Like, or if you haven't used it, I'm not. But it also makes me think of Entra Exporter, and like the parity there.
I think that's a question to the M365 DSC community, but I think there are some shared aspects, and I think there are also some difference to Entra Exporter. Because, for example, the user object level is something you can also do with the configuration manager and creating snapshots. But honestly, I would more focusing on the configuration and not having a tenant with 20,000 user object snapshots and controlling every property of a user, right? And we have also heard about this Entra backup stuff. So I think it's not a replacement for backup and disaster recovery strategy. So I think it makes quite important to split a little bit the use cases.
Do you know, and I mean, this is the snapshots you take in this, are they exportable out of it?
They are just a graph response at the end of the day, and you can reference to that one. But in the end of the day, it's super nice when you're doing, for example, change management, that you can point out, okay, we did this modification of the conditional access policy, and having also a reference, this was the configuration before and after, and having it also for a kind of rollback, because then you can see, okay, what has really be changed, and
Now there's a lot of limitations with it, right? Like we can't really cover 200,000 users or 200, well, I guess 195 CA policies.
Yes.
Right, but we have certain limitations, so people are going to want to do their critical assets and things like that.
Yeah, right. And I think that makes sense, especially also in the multi-tenant environment. So I did a session about that recently, and my, of course, number one goal was talking about conditional access tracking, and especially in this multi-tenant scenario, you like to make sure that everybody's using passkeys, right? And then having the policy in every tenant, and even if you are not responsible and there's something that maybe another tenant owner, you like to take care that they are not messing up with your accommodations.
So, I mean, you also mentioned within here the cross-tenant group sync, which also makes me think of user sync. And I mean, architecturally, this makes me think of, right, in some of these dev test QA scenarios, I know sometimes you'd have the challenge where your developers need something that looks like production. So, I mean, would you say it gives you the opportunity to, or would you use cross-tenant user sync, group sync to mirror a production Entra to a lower level, or do you have other concerns? I mean, I have the same sort of thoughts, I think, where you're going, but I was curious what.
So I think at the end of the day, we have always the devs that like to have also craft permissions and modify objects. And I think that's the reason you should have dedicated test accounts. But I think maybe we will have in the future also the way not only about detecting configuration drift, also having some like I will do the configuration across the tenants and apply changes. And then you could have maybe something like I create test users. So this is just ideas that comes to my head. I would say it's more about synchronizing privileges or role assignments or something like that to assign them in applications, but not for test account provisioning. So.
But I'm assuming also, though, in my mind, it also brings up the dreaded licensing question, because I think you need at least P2 or something in the target and source.
P1.
It's P1? Okay. Right. But I mean, it makes me think again, right, if it's like an Entra free, and I don't even know if you spin up like these tenants, I would think they just would be Entra free. So you might still be limited in like.
We opened a bottle when it comes now to license questions. I have to call my lawyer.
The users that get synced do need P1, and then typically there's the subscription. If you add a subscription to Entra. Then you get up to 50,000 monthly average users, licensed at the highest level. So that helps on both sides if you're doing like dual synchronization between tenants, that kind of thing. And historically, we've been able to do users. The nice advantage, groups can be used as groups on the other side, but really a lot of times it's just like, man, to add all these users to the list, right? I mean, I got 150 of them I want to do, but they're all in a group. Like, why can't I just pick the group that I know I want to sync? So now we get that opportunity, which is pretty nice. So.
And what is your impression about multi-tenant adoption in organization? Is that a big thing, or?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I mean, you said
not
the word
the only guy.
adoption. It's more like forced, right? It's like
Yeah,
it's a
right,
scenario
right.
that they end up
It's
in.
already there.
It comes about through mergers and acquisition. It comes about through separate legal entities and the requirements that come there. And I guess one of the things that, because I get tons of questions now about this based on what you've said, and I think about tiering and stuff like that, and I think about segmentation. So, for example, if I'm a developer, you mentioned that as an example, I might want to have that tenant completely isolated from my production tenant, so that if the global admin and my production tenant get owned, my dev tenant is reasonably safe, and I don't have supply chain compromises if I've got like multi-tenant apps and stuff like that. So when I think of like Entra tiering, I think of Entra ops, like a lot of work you do. What's your kind of thoughts on having a completely isolated tenant for dev versus leveraging these new GDAP capabilities to manage that tenant? Because I guess, again, we're talking about trade-offs and stuff like that, so you would get the benefit of a centralized management, but does that come at the cost of supply chain risk?
So I would say, but that's just my opinion, because we have GDAP and there's no B2B or any user object artifact from GDAP, I think it's quite a limited attack surface, because the user coming from the governing tenant exists only in the governing tenant. And but on the other side, we have the disadvantage, because you don't see any details about the assigned users in the governed tenant. So, for example, if I'm accepting the governance relationship, I can see this group object ID is now assigned to become a global admin, but on the side on the governed tenant, I don't see who's member of the group. So who has the permission? And also you can do beautiful nesting, and then it becomes even more complicated. And thanks for referencing Entra ops.
So your audit logs must still have their object ID, right? But you just can't resolve it?
Yeah, because they isolated, so they have no access to resolve the object ID. And that was the idea that I said, okay, we need some tooling that has limited Graph API permissions also in the governing tenant, so that I think you can resolve the group object ID, scanning, is there any nesting, who's member of the group, and having the full transparency.
I mean, I still think this makes me, though, not to sort of pitch the red tenant idea. And I mean a joke, because right, I've spoken about it. I know Thomas has done a lot of work on that stuff, but like, well, in a way, it's almost like having like a red forest. Truly now, I mean, I didn't work for an MSP, so the GDAP thing is still new, I think, for like a lot of organizations, but it makes me think you could potentially have this isolated scenario where your global admins are off in their own world and there are no GAs to attack like in production.
Yeah, and then that red tenant just becomes, you apply far more hardening to that than you could realistically apply to your other tenant.
So if I was like, hypothetically, a medical device manufacturer, and I have like hundreds of thousands of devices.
Just a scenario.
Just hypothetical. Yeah. No, but would you recommend, like, because like you're saying, right, I do all my development, my firmware, all of my product gets shipped out of this tenant over here. I want that isolated from my collaboration tenant over here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Would you end up doing two red to manage in that case? Because we probably wouldn't want shared, or like, what would your thoughts be on that design for maybe, somebody who's really got some more sensitive development type stuff on one side, or even like a Microsoft, right? Like they've got their services are all offered out of one thing, right? And they don't want their collaboration tenant compromised there to,
So what brings the most monthly active users?
Nice. Licensing.
I think we have already the answer when it comes to MSPs or CSPs, because Microsoft said we should have a dedicated tenant to do the customer access.
Totally.
And I think the whole tenant governance stuff allows a lot of capabilities to do such a design. And honestly, it's not only about we move users and the devices out of the production or the collaboration tenant, and that means we have now a fully isolation also when it comes to device management. Maybe something you like to avoid, that someone that taking care on the user devices should also be in a position to wipe PAW or privileged admin.
Yeah, I mean, that's always been a big sort of Intune split issue, right? Because generally Intune admins aren't usually in reality bucketed as tier 0. But even if you were doing PAW, right, you'd have the whole issue of not wanting them to touch your paws, but you can't like stop it.
And now you're not managing paws if you don't put them in into.
Right. And there's another aspect, and that makes really the game changer from my point of view. Now we are also in the position to move the role groups and the role assignments out of the tenant. Because in the past we had still identity governance, access packages, we had role assignable groups in the workload tenant, workforce tenant, call it whatever you like. And now everything is centralized, managed in this governing tenant, which could be also your red tenant or your administrative environment. And that even more limits the attack surface, because otherwise you need to isolate access package or entitlement between regular user access stuff and your privilege access packages.
Soft matching. Right? So, I mean, we had all the issues with soft matching, Entra Connect Sync, right? And we could do cloud takeover of objects. And, and if it's in that other tenant, now you...
It's the tenant boundary that is your security boundary, right?
And if I can ask you a question in terms of allowing your tenant to become governed by another tenant, what is the process around that and how secure is that? Because I'm like picturing like MITRE attack techniques and tactics, and I'm thinking persistence, and I'm thinking if I am an adversary and I can become the governing tenant.
In my opinion, the product group did a good job on considering potential abuse of that one. So there's a difference if you're already sharing a billing account between the two tenants. But if that's not the case, there's a three-handshake approach. So you, as a governed tenant, you will send an invitation to another tenant. Hey, I want to be under the control of you.
So you're not the child is almost asking
the parents.
Yeah, the parents.
Look after them.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay, so the child goes to the parent and says, hey, please be my parent. Then they have to say, yes, I will be your governing tenant.
Yes.
And then
there's a policy with the role assignments, and you can also inject a multi-tenant application as well, which is super smart as well, because you maybe like to have also non-human identity with privileges in the governed tenant. And then you send it back, and they accept the request. And then when you do some changes on the policy, maybe you like to have another role assignment or another multi-tenant application, then you need to update their request, and that is something there will be once again an acceptance by the governed tenant.
Right. So there's this three-way handshake at every point. I want more permission in that chain.
Right, and in addition, what I always recommend to have a block policy on conditional access to say if you are a service provider user, because you can do that, I block it for every organization except the one that I like to have invitation, because then you that should be already in place, because if you don't use GDAP, why not blocking every kind of request from GDAP, and that would be also defense and death approach.
Yeah. I mean, I was just going to say, I think that the tenant piece is interesting though, because you see a lot of orgs, or I've seen a lot that would have like a tier 0 Azure subscription, and not to sort of get in the Azure side too much, but it'd be so interesting, right? Because a lot of times, Azure RBAC is a mess, and you can have a separate sub, but ultimately, if you have a management group or something, again, right? Like, depending on how you have things architected, there's ways to sort of take over, right?
Yeah.
Ownership, get access to that stuff. Yeah. But I think it's interesting, in some of the stuff I did around Red Tenant wasn't just from the Entra side, but it was trying to like envision, like, okay, you have this tenant, you can also have your, Red subscription or something, and use like, what's it, the names escape my mind for the networking, right? Like peer-to-peer between two subs that aren't in the same. Yeah, right. To sort of like cover where, I guess the ramble is that you could have your DCs, all your high-value assets in a sub that is completely isolated from everything else. Gotcha. And again, like you hopefully won't have those attack paths that can be used, right? Because you'll see people using subs to then move into AD and on-prem and all that sort of stuff. So, but I mean, I think to me it's needing to think outside the box and not be Wild West. But I think sometimes when you try to talk about this stuff, and I know you've talked about the Red Tenant concept, and I've seen other like subscription isolation stuff. But a lot of times people are like, well, that's not what the docs say, sort of thing, right? And it's like, if it's not in the docs, we don't want to do it.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I think Microsoft's always been like just single tenant because complexity, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's always bit them
Yeah.
hard in the past.
Oh, yeah.
Like, you got all these forests and all these like domains and all the complexity that goes with transitive trusts and all the things.
Absolutely.
And it's like, man, so keeping it simple is great,
Yeah.
right?
But now we're back here.
I know.
I
know.
Now we have forest trust between tenants.
Right.
Child tenants?
So I'm curious though, for those who have set up an MTO, how does the governance piece, like, how's that experience look different? Is it the same flow? Is there a way to bolt it on top of it? Is it included? How does that look?
So I would say if you have MTO, and we are mostly talking about cross-tenant synchronization features in the MTO space as well, but it works on a parallel approach, and that is something which I would recommend because not everything can be granted through Entra roles or API permissions. So I would say when you're doing control plane Entra roles, definitely go the way with the GDAP. But for the MTO, we have also user access scenarios. So I think for the whole collaboration between tenants, the GDAP is only something related to the Entra story about the Entra delegation admin model. And one thing that you should keep in mind, if you establish a tenant governance relationship, there's some activities in the background, like modifying the cross-tenant access policies. And I think then when you like to do cross-tenant access for other stuff, like the MTO story, then you should also double-check if that fits to your configuration.
Well,
All right.
I think actually probably they'll be kicking us out of here soon. So. But I think any last thoughts on any of the stuff before we wrap it up for today?
Oh, geez. It's number one. I learned a ton here, especially in the tenant governance, which I was completely ignorant about, and I'm probably going to ask you a lot more questions. Feel free to the show. But no, it's good, and I think it's kind of a exciting time to be doing what we do. One of the things when you're talking about, hey, all of a sudden we have these, the thing that comes to mind is like the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah.
Insofar as the move from single tenants to multi-tenants, how we're back with having like federated forests and all that kind of stuff. And I just hope everything we've said ages very well, because I'm conscious that I go back and I watch old shows I've done and I'm like, oh, that wasn't the best advice. So I'm interested to see how some of that stuff ages. But it's a fun time to be doing what we're doing.
Yeah,
definitely.
That's why you stay up on things, right? I mean, you're continually learning.
Yeah.
and-
I just
easy to
follow
see.
you on Twitter.
We rolled out MFA 5-6 years ago for people, and it's changed. But I don't think anyone could blame. Well, I actually do blame you, Rue, for
I'll take that one.
bad advice with Rue. Is
But it is an interesting time in identity, right? So like we had user accounts, they had username, password. It took forever. We got smart cards, and then we had these standalone managed service accounts, group managed service accounts. Like all those things were 5 years apart or whatever. Now all of a sudden it's like, you've got passkeys, your password list. Oh, we got these agents. They're applications, but also users, and like identity. All this stuff is crazy. I mean,
Don't forget agents.
It's just
I feel like that's kind of the elephant in the room right now in a lot of agentic stuff.
So it's changing a lot. There's a lot in identity.
Yeah. So, thanks for joining us, David.
Thanks for having
It was great having you here, and again, in person. And thanks, Rue and Thomas, and
Thanks,
Michael. We'll hopefully be on the next episode, and hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you folks next month. And I guess before we go.